Hi everyone and welcome to Sami Rat Care. So today's video is all about boys and or books and their habitat, and then I'm going to go on to their diet side of things as well. So I'm going to cover the last two kind of elements in the kind of all about books series. So we're having this a little bit kind of more wobbly filmed than normal because I'm up the step ladders. Kip is visiting me, as you can see. Oh no, it's not Kip, it's Eclipse, I lie. Kip did visit me earlier. But yes, so I'm up here so that I can kind of show you around the bookcase properly and talk a little bit about what I consider when I'm considering book setups. So it's not perfect, and you have to bear with me because hopefully I won't fall off here if I do send help. Right, so book setups. What kind of things should we consider when we're thinking about books? Now, the first thing to consider is they are kind of chunkier, let's say, than does. So it goes back to the physical side of things. They are generally physically larger, and that also means they're physically kind of less agile generally as well. And of course this is different when they're babies. When they're babies they're very similar to does. They're very capable, agile, they can balance on very thin stuff, they can cope with things a lot more kind of wobbly. But as adults they can weigh quite a sizable amount. You're talking about 500 grams plus for most adult books, and they can be getting well up to the 750 kind of 800 gram range as well. So we need to consider this when we're doing setups. Also their lack of agility should be taken into account. So one thing I think about when I'm thinking about what I would call the connectors, so the stuff that goes from one area to another, when I've got a book cage I generally make it much more stable. So I will generally, so I'm using a lot of kind of branches here. They're not particularly thick branches, and I should say that my books are reasonably agile at the moment. They're quite young, they're relatively fit. Even kind of Eclipse, who's my biggest boy, is still quite able to manage thin but solid kind of immovable stuff. I do have a rope in here. I'll be honest, they don't really use the rope too much other than it gets in their way because it's a little bit loose. Next time I'll probably put it in a slightly different way, or I'll use something a little bit more chunky. So thinking about these connectors and making sure that they're quite solid. Books are more likely to use something that is kind of a less steep slope than those. So like they're more likely to use this branch than they are to use these. But I put a couple of the kind of taller straight up ones because I have young boys in there and I want to encourage them to use their kind of agility that they've got while they've got it. And actually, to be fair, like Sol and Eclipse, even though they're big lads, they use particularly the junctions to kind of get up and almost act like a ladder to get up to the hammocks. So onto sleeping places. In my book groups I tend to like to provide something nice and big so they can fit all of them in. Now bear in mind my book group is quite small, there is 5 in there at the moment, so I don't need to provide anything too big. But what I find most of the time, my books are nearly always found sleeping together, whereas my doe group tends to spread out a little bit more and sleep in smaller groups, mixed up still, but you know, smaller groups generally, whereas the books is like, yeah, everybody in the pile. So I make sure there's at least one big hammock where they can all fit. Stop fighting. Sorry, the girls are fighting downstairs. But I give them choices as well, so there is other places to sleep. And being that it's summer as well, we need to bear in mind that books are much more likely to suffer from the heat than does, and that comes back to their size again. They have, because they're a bigger mass, they have a smaller relative surface area to lose the heat out of, so they can suffer from heat stroke much more. So with it being summer, I'm using the kind of thin Hessian sack as a hammock. This is also very popular as a sleeping area, which is why it's fairly flat. I don't expect them to climb up that is purely there for them to perch themselves on, and like you get limbs dangling out, tails, balls dangling out, and it all helps them kind of keep cool. So it's one of their favourite hot weather sleeping places. Same goes with this, it's quite cool because it's kind of got little slits in there. And it gives them a place that they can sleep. They tend to kind of like to drape over the top of it rather than sleeping in it as much. Other thing that's very important, wheel size. So a lot of people tell you that books don't run in wheels. Now that is not necessarily the case. All my boys actually do run in that wheel. But the reason, in part, that they run in it is A, I start them young, but B, and I will say both Sol and Eclipse weren't brought up with a wheel. They came to me when they were probably about 10, 12 weeks old. I have a big wheel, so that's a 16-inch Tic Tac, so that's as big as they get, effectively, in the UK, at least at the moment. Half the reason that books don't kind of run on wheels is because they're generally a bit small for them, particularly big, long books, like Eclipse. Eclipse is a massive rat. And there's no way that he could comfortably run on a smaller wheel than this. And he doesn't run on it as much as Sol and Bobby and Kip do, but he does run on it, and that's quite nice to see. the size definitely helps with that. Other things that I tend to do, put plenty of space for them. So whilst there is a lot of kind of branches going into the soil here, unlike the girls, I don't have large obstacles in there. I mean, there's a water bowl there, which is mostly there for the springtails, but I'll be honest, the boys quite like paddling in it because they're weirdos. But yes, I try and keep more of the floor space free for books, and that's because being bigger animals, they need a longer space to get that kind of like bounding around. They also quite like to wrestle. It gives them a bit more space to wrestle without getting themselves caught in things. So that works quite well. And of course, litter tray. Books are supremely lazy, so you really do, like more so than does. I have known does purposefully get out of a hammock and wander across the cage and then pee. I've not known many books to do that by choice. So it's literally the hammock they sleep most in, their litter tray. It's not a hard kind of choice for them. And actually, if they sleep in this hammock up here, in this pot here has also got litter, so it's really, really easy. They have a choice of 2 toilets. The nearest surfaces, both of them are happy for them to use as a litter because they are a litter tray. And that's definitely something to take into account with books. Right, so let us go downstairs and talk about food. Mostly because it's going to be a little bit more comfortable if I can sit down somewhere rather than standing on a rather wobbly thing. Right, so book diet. Now, books, there are some things that you want to take into account when you're thinking about a good diet for them. The main thing with that, sorry boys, I'm going to need to, I'm currently out playing, so we'll probably get some visits now I've sat down. So the main thing to consider in terms of book diet is, when I talked about health, I talked about kidney health, and it's this acknowledgement that particularly in books, more so than does, their kidney health is one of their limiting factors on their life. Now, kidney health really comes into kind of the forefront around about, well, usually over a year, getting on towards 18 months. We may not notice any symptoms, but the vast majority of books will be starting to show some kind of internal signs of kidney degeneration then. And that means that we really need to respect that and make sure that their diet is low protein, kidney friendly, low phosphorus. So I would say with books, it's more important than ever that you read up on kidney friendly diets. Now, I'm not going to go in detail in it here because there is a video on it in the feeding section, but it's one that you should definitely look into. Little Miss Magpie, hopefully she won't eat my nose this time. But yes, it's definitely one that you should consider when you're talking about books. In fact, generally speaking, as a book owner, I will try and make my mix kidney friendly, kind of regardless really, all the way through their life, so I don't have to think too much about it when they get older. Then obviously, like with any kind of older rat, you need to keep an eye on their condition and feed to that. So bear in mind that they may need extras and such as they get older and skinnier. That's the same for books or does though. So that's the kind of kidney side of things. Other thing to take into account is citrus and mango. So in most cases, what rats can't have is the same regardless of sex. The only difference is this kind of something called D-limonene, which I always called limousine, but it isn't limousine. I quite often spell it like that as well. It's not how it is meant to be spelled. It's limonene, which is the active, or one of the active ingredients in kind of citrus peel, citrus oil. And actually it's in a whole host of foods, and a lot of people don't understand this. It's in most vegetables to some extent and various other things. In itself, for does, for mice, for humans, it's not an issue. In fact, there is some evidence that shows that it's got good cancer fighting properties. However, in male rats, if it builds up, and there is kind of a question on the build-up side of things and how much it builds up, but if it builds up, it will cause problems, and it will cause problems around the kidneys generally. Hence why we kind of keep an eye on it, in particular for books. But weirdly, it only affects books. It literally does not affect does or even male mice, which are very closely related. So it's one to be aware of. But when I say kind of citrus and mango, these are foods that are naturally quite high in it, and particularly the skin of that kind of thing. So citrus fruit is actually pretty fine. You'll see people saying do not ever feed anything orange to a book ever or they'll die. That's simply not true. I wouldn't go out of my way to feed my books lots and lots of orange and such, but if there was a food that I wanted to feed them with a bit in it, I wouldn't really worry about it. But what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't feed kind of orange skin to them. or specifically anything containing like high levels of citrus oil. And I probably wouldn't bother feeding mango. To be fair, I think mango's evil anyway. Not my favourite food, so we're not going to have any in. But I would probably avoid feeding them mango. But what I will say is a lot of the concern over D-limonene was around the fact that it was believed that it constantly built up over the rat's life. So a meal with a small amount in wasn't a big deal. But if they had several of those meals, then over their life it could cause problems. The belief was at the time that you could never get rid of this stuff. It constantly built up through the life. However, there has been recent studies that have shown that the body can start getting rid of it. So as long as you're not feeding lots regularly, then actually the odd meal containing even quite high amounts of D-limonene isn't a big deal. But it is one that I would probably kind of generally avoid, just for kind of like, there's no particular benefits in it in most cases. And, you know, there's a lot of other foods that they can eat quite happily. When I mentioned that lots of other foods contain it, they do. They contain it in really low amounts, so it's not something that you need to worry about really at all. But it's that understanding that it isn't that orange and mango and lemon is toxic to rats. That's not the case. It's understanding that it's something that you don't want them to get a lot of, this D-limonene, this one tiny bit of an ingredient in the kind of citrus and mango world. It doesn't affect does at all. And it's just one to not be stupid with, really. Don't overdo it. It's like with a lot of things with rats. Take it with a pinch of salt. Though not literally, because they probably shouldn't have too much salt. But apply a bit of common sense and don't overdo things, and it will be okay, basically. So I don't kind of worry too much if I see, like, I'm trying to feed my rats. Let's say they're a bit old and poorly and I've got some baby food that contains orange citrus extract or something like that. I don't worry about it. They just get, it's going to make them eat, and they need to eat, they eat it. If I had an orange segment and one of the rats whipped it off me and ran into the cage and started eating it, yeah, fair games. They've won that one. I'm not exactly going to take it off them and eat it myself. But I wouldn't stick a whole orange on a weekly basis into a book cage, whereas I have actually done that a few times with my does. So it's one to kind of bear in mind with that. Really though, that is probably the main things to consider. Everything else in terms of feeding is the general rules of thumb that you apply to both sexes, so keep it healthy. If it's something that we can eat, generally it's something that they can eat, with like very few exceptions. Just don't overdo it, because much like with does, though to a slightly lesser extent, if bucks get fat, it's bad for their health. When you're talking about kidneys and you're talking about hind leg degeneration, you're talking about heart issues, which are common with bucks. If they get fat, it puts massive loads on those. So do respect their weight, keep them nice and slim and healthy, and they will thank you for it. So I think that's over and out from me and Kip. I'm sure we started out with me and Kip as well. And that's it for the book series, and I will try and start with the doe series hopefully sometime this coming week. So bye for now.